Welcome to Paulogia Live, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians live here from lovely Paulogia Studios in Nova Scotia, Canada, on the East Coast, where I'm coming to you on a Friday evening, for me at least. It might be slightly different for you guys, not quite our normal time, but I've been traveling, I've been away, we've had visitors, and it's been too long since I've had one of my proper Apology Live shows, so I thought I would do that again today. Unfortunately, when I was setting up for the show very recently, I discovered that some software updates in the last month have made a lot of the stream not work. So hopefully you guys are at least hearing me right now. Let me know. I'm sure I would see something in the chat at this point if you couldn't hear me. Some of the things might not be working. It looks like some of the chat bots and things aren't quite going as smoothly as they normally do, but that's all right, because we have a full slate of interesting topics, interesting videos to respond to today. As always on Paulogia Live, it's a two-part show. In the first part of the show, we discuss some predetermined topics, some video segments that I have plucked from the internet in the last week or so that I felt I wanted to discuss with you guys. Fear not, this will include the next part 3 of the Jenny, Why the Bible, 7 Reasons Why the Bible is Reliable saga. So stay tuned for that. That's on its way. In the second half of the show, I take a look at your super chats and we discuss whatever kind of topics you guys want to discuss, and maybe we'll go a little bit later tonight, depending on what's happening, depending on your mood, depending on my mood, based on the fact that it's Friday night and not in the middle of a work day like we often do this show. So I'm excited to get going. As you guys know, I like to ramp up with some, I want to say, lower tier videos. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to discuss, get our momentum going towards some of the more difficult topics in the end. But today, I think that these more reflect merely the length and not completely the scope and the intellectual rigor of the videos involved, because strangely today, as we go through it, the very first video up, maybe this is just a sign of how his career is going, very first video up will be from William Lane Craig. Yes, that William Lane Craig, Lovar Bill. Oh, worse. William Lane Craig, and it's a video that he is entitled "Atheism is Worse Than Magic." Now, I suspect it is his social media team of sorts that are taking some of his old discussions and chopping them up into shorts. Unfortunately, the video itself doesn't give us much of a context for what he's going to be talking about here, but I think it kind of stands for itself. Atheism is worse than magic.
Than magic. Yeah. When you think about it, it really is. In magic, when the magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, at least you've got the magician.
And I want just actually to double check to make sure that everyone can hear the video, because I'm not really trusting any of that today based on all the things. But I'm sure you'll let me know in the chat if you can't hear it. But yes, at least with theism, our magic has a magician, so our magic is better.
Right, but on atheism, the universe just popped into being uncaused out of absolutely nothing.
Okay, so I'm guessing if you've been around for a while, you probably understand my objection now all of a sudden. William Lane Craig, who's studied the Kalam and all these arguments for God more than anyone, his objection is that the magic is that the universe popped into existence from nothing. And of course, at Paulogia and various skeptics and cosmologists around the world, we all say, that's not what we think. We aren't positing that the universe came from nothing, at least not nothing in a philosophical sense. It might be nothing in terms of a nothing we would recognize sense. But if you want to argue that the Big Bang was the start of our particular universe, the instantiation, our particular instantiation of space-time, that says nothing about matter because something had to expand. That's the singularity model, and there's other various models that are out there. But no, we don't think, Dr. Craig, that there ever was nothing. In fact, that is the theist point of view, not the materialist secularist point of view.
So if you do not believe in magic, you should resist any kind of attempt to deny the argument by rejecting the first premise.
I'm assuming that everything that begins to exist has a cause, is the first premise that he's speaking of here. Of course, we accept that things that begin to exist have a cause, but what we're saying is that we don't think that necessarily matter nor energy or something or some proto-energy, some precursor to it ever actually had a beginning. So, in philosophical terms, not physics terms, we're talking about brute facts here. William Lane Craig wants to posit that God is a brute fact because he will giggle all the more and all the same if you say, well, who created God? He thinks that's a ridiculous question because he's defined it in such a way that God is an uncreated being. But everyone else is on equal philosophical ground if we just say, well, that's what we think matter is, or energy is, or something, the material that the universe is comprised of. All we have to do is make that a brute fact, and we are on identical philosophical footing. We don't need to giggle. We don't need a magician.
Because then you're believing something worse than magic.
Yeah, so no, you're not believing in something worse than magic, because we are actually positing that a thing that we know exists, say energy, which we know cannot be created nor destroyed, wasn't created or destroyed. This is something we observe. For William Lane Craig to posit there is a God that is a precursor to that would need evidence. That is adding assumptions. So materialism here is the simpler form. Hey, look, the chat is working. Cool. Kinda. Only kind of. Rats. Looks like it's only partially working. Anyway, thank you so much. Too Young to Feel Old for the super chat. We will be getting to the super chats at the end. I just got slightly distracted. Anyhow, that was the first video. As always, we like to warm these up, so we're going to get more difficult as we go. Next up, only slightly more so, from Dr. William Lane Craig, is we have Mike Winger, resident youth pastor turned YouTuber.
I've noticed many people don't believe in God because of evolution. Is evolution contrary?
Okay, so this is a short video that he's done talking about evolution. Is evolution contrary to God? And Mike has noticed that a lot of people disbelieve God because of evolution. Now, I famously made a video, my very first video on this channel was Ken Ham Made Me an Atheist. Now that's kind of a joke because it's a bit of an oversimplification of what happened, obviously, but it's nice for rhetoric. When I came to accept that evolution was real, was a scientific fact, and also that the theory of evolution, the scientific theory of biological evolution, had incredible explanatory power. Both of those things are correct. I didn't abandon my Christianity because of that. Specifically, it just set me on a journey of trying to figure out what in the Bible I could trust or what I couldn't trust. I don't think that Mike has phrased this correctly, that people, as soon as they come to accept evolution, that they immediately reject God. Obviously, there's theistic evolutionists all over the place. A lot of Christians believe in evolution, so those don't go hand in hand. I don't think they're causal. But what evolution, of course, does allow is it is a very natural way of looking at things and figuring out that the things that we used to think that we needed God to explain, we no longer need God to explain. Evolution is one of those things, the biological diversity of life. whether you think God controlled evolution or not, it's a process that doesn't require God, as best as we can tell. So yeah, it's evolution is problematic. I'm with you, Mike. And for the record, Mike actually doesn't accept evolution, but his argument today is that even if the thing he doesn't think is true, that's evidence for God. Because, of course, everything is evidence for God in a Mike Winger worldview.
Glory to God. Let me give you a simple example. Here's my cell phone. Imagine my cell phone happened from an explosion. Maybe we could prove it.
Okay. As soon as you hear someone who doesn't accept evolution talk about an explosion, that is a red alert sign, red flag, that they don't understand evolution. I didn't understand evolution when I was a Christian. And yeah, and the notion of that anything related to an explosion can somehow correlate to evolution as an illustration is entirely ridiculous. And you just, yeah, we'll get into it a little bit more later. But at this point, we can know and understand that Mike Winger doesn't understand that which he rejects.
We could prove that the cell phone happened from an explosion and all the particles of glass, they kind of came together and the heat was just right, that it sort of came into this flat, perfectly solid form. Wouldn't we not therefore be logically reasonable by saying, boy, somebody brilliant must have planned that explosion?
Okay. So this is how Mike thinks. Mike thinks this is a great analogy, that an explosion happened, that glass heated and coalesced and formed into his cell phone. And therefore you would, I mean, we're going to set aside for a minute that's nothing like what evolution would describe. Mike then wants to say, well, wouldn't the designer of that explosion be amazing? Yes, it would. Now, we can actually even set the explosion aside. Let's say that the year is, 1700. And the smartest human on the earth in 1700 walked out of his log cabin and had a modern iPhone, Samsung Galaxy, something. Had a modern phone. That also wouldn't explain things because, again, that would be someone godlike, but he would have invented something useless. So there's no... The phone, which we know was intelligently designed, happened step by step, right? We had the very first telephones, Alexander Graham Bell and others, who created the first telephone style communication. There was the invention of batteries. There was the invention of harnessing radio waves. There were invention of antennas. There was invention of, first of all, just glass, well-prepared glass, and then eventually touch screens and screens. Like all these things happened separately, iteratively, with intelligent design happening to eventually lead us to the point where the smartest people on earth could take all of those parts and imagine them together to create a phone. Now, where am I going with this? Well, Mike wants to try and say that if God was behind evolution, that it's similar to an explosion that created this final result. That's not, even if you want to give God credit for evolution, that is not the process that God has done here. It's not that Adam showed up on the first day if God created evolution. If God created evolution, if God was guiding it, he still guided the spectrum that was chemistry through to biology. The first molecules, the first proteins, the first RNA, the first DNA, that all still happened slowly. God built on that. Now, God may have set up the conditions of the universe that would allow that to happen and maximize that to happen. And then once molecules were replicating, eventually forming cells, eventually forming replication with variation, eventually getting to even sexual reproduction, all these things. But God didn't design an explosion for this to happen. God would have designed a process that was very slow and entirely natural and indistinguishable from a natural process, is the thing, Mike. We don't see marks of, boom, there was an explosion and cells were on the scene or humans were on the scene or any of that kind of stuff. Like, this is just, it's not going to convince your theistic evolutionist friends either that you know what you're talking about.
That doesn't mean it was an accident. It means it was just even more brilliant, because not only did they cause it to happen, but they caused it to happen through one act of creation. But I don't think it's accurate, but I would absolutely use it as evidence for God.
All right. So Mike admits he doesn't think it's accurate. He clearly doesn't even understand it, but he's going to claim it as evidence for God, because if it did happen, somehow in the weird way that he imagines it happened, it's evidence for God. Now, I don't disagree. I actually think it would be more impressive for a God to create through evolution than through the story that we're told in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, where he creates, all the kinds individually, because it is kind of smarter to set up a system that allows for the diversity, much like, in its own way, if you write software to do a very specific task, say you have Photoshop or you have Google Chrome, or you got very specific software for different tasks, that's amazing and that's great. And that means they were very talented engineers that made that happen. But if we're on this cusp now where we're actually putting together software with large language models and that, where we don't actually know where it's going to go. We're kind of setting up the parameters by which it can go on its own and evolve in its own way. Is that more or less intelligent than the person who designs a piece of software? I think that could be a debate, which is more or less intelligent. But anyway, all this to say, Mike doesn't understand evolution, but he wants to claim it for God. Mike, there are much better ways to phrase this that are more intellectually satisfying and would actually ring true to the universe. Yeah. Sorry, Mike. This is the kind of thing that would have convinced 5 years ago, 6 years ago, me who didn't understand any of this, but you need a better analogy, my friend. That said, I know a lot of Christians who would agree with you that God created evolution. So there we go. All right. That's our second video of the day. Our third video of the day comes from someone I rarely cover on this topic, though he's often covered on the internet, and that is one Jordan Peterson. A little short video. I don't suspect that Jordan Peterson put this out himself. Someone, I think, cribbed a bit of his lecture and put it as a vertical video online. But and I don't know who he's discussing this with. He's having a bit of a debate about whether we can have evidence for God. So let's see what he has to say.
There's a paradox in the notion of whether we can know God exists. And the paradox is, in part, you can't know God. And so can you know that something exists that you can't understand? And
so he's clearly, again, we're catching this midstream, mid-conversation. Jordan Peterson is putting forth that if there is a divine being of some sort, that because we can't truly know him, that we can't know that he exists. I think he's trying to explain why, in his own unique worldview, that a God existing is very compatible with our being unsure about it. The problem with this is you don't have to be able to... My dog does not have to know me in the sense that my dog doesn't necessarily know my thoughts or understand my reasons for doing things or understand, who my relatives are, who my friends are, what all these kind of things. My dog catches only a very brief sense. My dog doesn't know I'm an atheist. In all these senses, my dog could never really understand me or know me in the same sense that another human potentially could. But my dog has plenty of evidence to know that I exist. My dog recognizes my smell, my scent, understands some of my behaviors, some of my patterns, even understands sometimes when I'm breaking pattern, even though they would never understand why. Jordan, if there is a God who exists and really wants to have a relationship with us, it is not incompatible, the notion that there would be sufficient evidence for us to at least know their existence, even if our plane of being could never match that being's plane of being. Does that make sense? I hope it does.
Answer is, well, then maybe that's why you only see God's back in some real sense, right? You get hints, and maybe.
I mean, that's in the same ballpark. You see his back, and in some sense, you get hints, but that's there. That needn't be the case. I mean, sure, that might be a case that perhaps this God that you posit exists doesn't want us to know them in any kind of real sense, and that's fine. That's a deistic God who's kind of walked away. But a God who wants to have a relationship with us can give us more than hints, right? It's not an incompatible notion. You haven't explained anything here.
You get hints if you open yourself up in the right way, and one of the ways you open.
So again, my dog doesn't need to open herself up in the right way to know that I exist, or that my neighbors exist, or that my kids exist. Just because two different beings are on different, shall we say, levels of consciousness. I don't love that term, but levels of cognition or levels of understanding, they absolutely can at least assuredly know that each other exists because we are interacting in the same realm.
Yourself up in the right way is not to ask for what you want in the God is a celestial butler manner, but to ask how it is that you could transform yourself so that you could be a better agent of the divine will or something like that.
No. So again, if this God wants to have a relationship with us, my dog need not try to sit around thinking, well, how can I become more human so that I can interact with my human, or the human that is living in the house with us? That's not something that the lower creature needs to do. If I want to have a relationship with my dog, I'm not making my dog change its nature in some fundamental way to make that happen, right? That's on me, just as it's on God, if he wants to have a relationship with everyone, to give sufficient evidence in whatever way we can understand, not to stomp around with the feet with the thing he created, with the limitations he created, to overcome those limitations to create that relationship. Maybe that's kind of weird, effed up parent-child relationship God wants to have, but that's not God of the Bible. And if I need to imagine ways that a being I don't know might exist, and change my personality to make that happen, that's a non-starter for me. I'm out.
What do you find when you do that? When you embrace responsibility, what you find is meaning, which is a route to the divine.
Well, the secular.
That's meaningless word salad. Serving each other is a path to the divine, is just labeling positive traits, labeling helpful traits, labeling traits that help propagate us as a species through entirely naturalistic rationalization as divine, right? So if you just want to call anything you want divine, well, physical attractiveness, that's divine. solving math problems, that's divine. Like, if you just want to label anything positive as divine, then you're just having a conversation with your buddies with, you know, a mental wanking session, as it were. You're not defining anything. You're not making helpful predictions. You're just labeling stuff.
This would say, well, without God, you could still find meaning in service to others. And I would say, yes, that's true. But
in case you missed that start part. So yeah, a natural person would say, a naturalist would say, that in serving others, you can get good feelings and find meaning in that. And that is, of course, as we are a social species, that is our survival, one of our survival advantages, in that we are cooperative. We're going to naturally, our species is going to naturally select for that cooperation to release endorphins, right? We're going to feel good about our contribution to the group. That doesn't require anything divine. Entirely explained naturally.
the reason you find meaning in the service to others is because that's one step on the ladder to the divine. Well, Nietzsche.
No, that's meaningless. That doesn't. The reason we find meaning in service to others is that we have empathy. We know that our lives are better when we are served, when we are helped. And so we feel some of those same feelings when others are helped, not to mention the actual survival advantage of helping our tribe, helping our group, even helping someone who isn't part of our tribe. We can still feel those same endorphins because that's what's going to evolve. The people who cooperated the most were the tribes that survived the most and therefore passed on our genes. So it's not surprising that our genes carry rewards for cooperation.
said God is
Calling it divine adds nothing to the conversation.
dead, and what's going to happen? Nihilism?
Sorry, I spoke over that tag there. So he's it was a quote about Nietzsche, and he was saying, well, Nietzsche said, how does this all work out? And he said, nihilism. And it was a weird tag that whoever edited that video put on a non sequitur sentence at the end. Anyhow, ultimately, I'm actually okay with nihilism in its own way, not philosophical nihilism, and that I need to walk around with my head held low. But I do accept that ultimately there will be a heat-death universe, and anything that happens on this live stream or this YouTube channel, technically working or not, won't really matter much tomorrow, necessarily, even let alone years and down the line. So ultimately nihilism. But no, we do find meaning in all these other things. We don't need God to explain that. We don't need divinity. These are just nonsense words, the way Jordan Peterson uses them. So I thought, I just kind of felt a certain kind of way about that, and I would pass that along to you. You're welcome. All right. So for our next video, we're going down the heavy hitters of apologetics, as it were, and we're getting now to time for Frank Turek. And Frank Turek, in his new video, promises that he can prove the resurrection of Jesus in 2 minutes or less. Everyone ready? Here we go.
There's only two possibilities when it comes to the resurrection. It either happened or it didn't happen.
Well done, Frank. We got to praise Frank when he gets something right, and he got something right here. He made an actual true dichotomy. Either the resurrection of Jesus happened or it did not happen. Those are the only two choices. Well done. I feel like it's going to get worse from here.
Right? If it happened, then Jesus is Lord. You've heard Lord.
All right. Now that Nessie, no. Already now you've gone off the rails. All that we can prove from saying that Jesus rose from the dead is that Jesus rose from the dead. Lazarus rose from the dead. He's not Lord in the Christian stories, of course. Jesus and the disciples ended up rising other people from the dead in the various stories. None of those people were lowered. And I think Frank would want to say that Jesus rose himself from the dead, but that isn't established by establishing that he rose from the dead. That would be a whole extra step that he did it himself. So, no Frank. But you know what? I'm gonna leave this one now. He's obviously going through the liar, lunatic, Lord trilemma, which we all know is a false trilemma. There are other options, but Frank's going to prove it in 2 minutes. Let's leave the Lord part for now.
Lord, liar, lunatic, right? Okay, he's the Lord. Okay, if it didn't happen, either the apostles, the New Testament writers, lied, or what's the other option?
Well, no, you've already made a mistake before you've considered that, because you're conflating a few things here. Already, you said apostles, and then you corrected that to New Testament writers. You're actually now assuming that the New Testament writers were apostles, which is not established at all. In fact, if I accept even most generously the church tradition about the authorship of the Gospels, 2 of the Gospels are very much not written by apostles or eyewitnesses. Luke and Mark are not even supposed to have been written by eyewitnesses. So those are not people who needed to do any making things up or fabricating. Although maybe they did, and we'll get to that. They were passing along stories that other people said. So, already off the rails, Frank. But he smuggles in so many ideas shotgun that in the end it kind of makes sense. So that's why we have to pause it on every half sentence here to see where Frank is deluding himself and or his audience. It's maybe a dichotomy. He's either lying about it or he's just mistaken.
They were deceived. They were mistaken, right? They thought he had resurrected from the dead, and they wrote it down and they went and died for it, but he...
No, see, look at all the things he's throwing in there. First of all, we don't know that the people who first reported Jesus rising from the dead, if they were mistaken, were the same people by any stretch that wrote it down. And we've also not established in any way that the people who first reported Jesus rising from the dead suffered in any kind of way, let alone died. We don't even know that they were out there willing to die, because we don't know who was telling those first stories to try and attach those names. So, Frank, this proof is looking pretty bad all over the place. You're adding in assumptions that are not warranted.
Didn't really die, or it didn't really rise from the dead. Now, why are these 2 things implausible?
Well, depending on who you're talking about, if we want to be generous and steelman this, let's assume that Frank is talking about the first people to report that Jesus rose from the dead, as opposed to these other weird conflations he's made.
Well, they had no motive to lie about the resurrection, as we've already pointed out, right?
Well, how did you establish that? First of all, you can't even tell me who the people are. Second of all, you're just psychoanalyzing people who you don't know who they are. They may have had all kinds of motivations to make this up. For example, let's say that they were the apostles and they were, low-paid fishermen. Or who cares about the pay? They were fishermen, and they didn't like being fishermen. That's a back-breaking, laborious job. Turns out, being a religious leader is a little easier on your back. And, keeps you away from the smell of fish and things. There's all kinds of reasons why someone might lie to create a new religion. It doesn't mean that they had the foresight for things to work out. Like they didn't, maybe when they did this, they were naive, not thinking that they would be persecuted in any way. There's just, you cannot declare, Frank, that there's no possible motives. I just came up with several off the top of my head. I'm sure everyone in the chat is coming up with their own.
Because all they got, they were beaten, tortured, and killed for saying it was true.
No, we don't know that. See, that's not on the table. We don't know that the first people reporting the resurrection were beaten or tortured or killed or even called bad names or made uncomfortable, because we don't know who they were or anything about their life after Jesus passed. We just don't know. Christian tradition wants to give us these stories. But man, that's not on the table here, Frank.
In fact, they had a big motive to deny the resurrection. They're Jews. They don't want to get kicked out of the temple.
Okay, they were with Jesus when Jesus was alive. They were already getting kicked out of the temple. If they were concerned about that, they wouldn't have been following Jesus, because Jesus was already causing trouble. If these stories about him in the Gospels are true, which is also not necessarily on the table, but let's be generous about it. And also, Jews in the first century were not a homologous religion any more than you can say that Christianity is a religion that has unified beliefs across the board. There were apocalyptic Jews. There were Jews who were more loyal to the temple. Frankly, it seems like there were even secular Jews of their own of a sort that were going along with this for the tradition. There were Hellenistic Jews who were leaning toward, the theology and the ideas and the philosophy of their Roman overlords. And that's just to name, again, a handful off the top of my head. There were, to say just Jews would do X or Jews would do Y was no more true in the first century than it would be today. And that's just silly.
They don't want to be excommunicated. They don't want to be thrown out of the...
Why not? Like again, there were all kinds of notions. There were different sects of Judaism who all had their own little communities. So shifting from one community of Jews to another was not a foregone. It's not a foregone conclusion that you were going to be destitute because you forsook Jewish orthodoxy of the day, as defined, I guess, by those in charge of the temple. Like, no, Frank.
Chosen People Club? Why would they do this? Could they have been mistaken? Well, they had no expectation of a resurrection. They weren't.
Could they be mistaken? And the answer Frank gave was, well, they weren't expecting it. So lots of problems with this. If you want to believe the Gospels, Jesus was going around telling people that he was going to be raised. So certainly, even if they didn't understand everything fully, if the Gospel accurately records Jesus' words, they were expecting it in some extent and in some way. But also, I can be mistaken entirely about things that I didn't expect. So, for example, I am not expecting that my house will be burgled tonight. I think that's the word. That someone's going to break in. Not expecting it. But if something happens to change my mind, if I hear a noise, I might, suddenly go and look and investigate. I'm not expecting a dragon to roar up in my backyard tonight either. But if circumstances of my psyche are such that I might hallucinate a dragon back there, I might end up being mistaken that I saw a dragon, even though I wasn't expecting one in any way. Like, Frank, do you hear yourself at all? This is not proof.
Expecting a resurrection and then maybe saw him and assumed he had risen from the dead when he really hadn't.
Yeah. So it doesn't matter if you're expecting Jesus to rise from the dead or not. If one or more of the disciples had some kind of hallucination of a risen Jesus, of their friend, one way to interpret that hallucination would be that he was risen from the dead, whether you are expecting it or not. The expecting it isn't a factor here.
They weren't expecting it. And if they were mistaken, they could have easily been corrected by enemies showing Jesus' dead body. They could have.
No. That is assuming a whole lot of things. First of all, that is assuming that there were enemies of Christianity soon enough that a recovered corpse would have been recognizable in some way. Now, I know that first century Judaism included some embalming sometimes and some ways of preserving corpses in certain ways, but it doesn't matter. There's after X number of days, bodies are no longer useful in the first century to definitively identify someone. Certainly there were enough bodies out there that would have looked roughly similar to Jesus. Hey, here's another, first century Jew who died around the same time. You're not going to prove anything to anyone by pulling up a partially decayed body. So you're assuming with that in this very tight time frame where the body was recognizable, that was a thing, that there even were enemies of Christianity at that point. Next, you're assuming then that they knew where to find this body. We know that at least some of the bodies, and I would argue that most of the bodies who were crucified were handled in a way that you couldn't go back and find them. They were put into unmarked graves of various levels of respect, but you couldn't, it needn't have been this tomb situation where we can point to the particular hole that Jesus was in. So you're assuming a whole lot of things here, Frank. So as far as we know, the enemies of Christianity were coming around decades later, right? So 20 years after Elvis died, someone producing a corpse of Elvis wasn't going to convince any of the people who came to be convinced that he wasn't dead. This is just nonsense. This is not a thing.
But just gone to the tomb and taken out Jesus's body and said, stop
You're assuming there was a tomb.
all this nonsense talk about the resurrection. He's dead. They didn't do.
Yeah, and you're also making this great assumption that there were enemies of Christianity who were powerful enough to do that kind of thing. Again, until decades later, didn't matter. And like when Nero was an enemy of Christianity, he didn't care what the theology was or anything like that. He was looking for scapegoats. When Christians got in trouble, as far as we can tell in the early decades of Christianity, it was because they were causing trouble, not because of their theology. We haven't found any records saying because they believed Jesus rose from the dead, they were in trouble. They were literally disturbing the peace, and or they weren't praying to the right gods to create the rain so that the neighbors didn't like them. Again, no one cared about whether Jesus was alive or dead or not. They only cared that the Christians were or were not sacrificing to the gods that they thought was going to make the community's life better. So this is all silly.
Do that. Why? Because he wasn't dead. So.
Or they didn't know where the body was, or the body was already in such a state that it wouldn't have proved a single thing. Or they weren't powerful enough to exhume a body. A lot of possibilities here, Frank. These are not dilemmas. You're not giving us all the options. You're picking a handful of things, adding in Christian assumptions about the story, and you think you've made a point.
Seems to me it really did happen, and this is the conclusion. Jesus is Lord, and if Jesus is Lord...
It just seems to Frank like that's the way it happened. All right, Frank. Well, I don't know why you even went out on this endeavor with this little chart, because you already just concluded that it was true. So neat. And now you're actually just going along with repeating your mistake just because Jesus rose from the dead, that he is Lord. Beyond the scope of what I care about, because you haven't established it first, but step too far.
Lord, then all we need to do is see what he wants us to do. Right?
Okay. Well, did Frank prove the resurrection in under 2 minutes? I know I paused him and rambled and I made it much longer than 2 minutes. My apologies. But did that video convince you that Jesus rose from the dead? Let me know in the chat. Let me know in the comments. All right, that was Frank Turek. Now, this video is a little bit different than what I would normally cover on this channel, but it caught my attention, and I just kind of wanted to get it out there and maybe start some discussion in the chat and in the comments for you guys and what you think. I was made aware of a brief clip of a live stream from a YouTuber known as Jaden Animations. Now, Jaden Animations, as I understand it, typically covers what I would consider to be lighthearted things, Pokemon, video games, animation. It's my understanding that she is a VTuber of sorts, that, like I do on my other channel, her persona is reflected by a cartoon on screen, for example, and that Jaden likes to have fun with her channel and all her activities online. Well, I started seeing some Christians get quite upset about Jaden Animation and wanting to cancel her. And so I needed to look up exactly what it was that Jaden Animation had done that made the Christians so angry. And let's take a look and see if we agree.
Have emerged from an egg in a place where there was nothing. Then it shaped the world.
Yeah, and the lions would destroy it.
Okay. So, unfortunately, I have yet to find the full context of this clip, even though I've looked for it. But based on this slight introduction, so Jaden's co-host, who unfortunately I do not know his name, is discussing a video game scenario. I'm from context, it seems like a video game scenario where there was, in the context of the game or the story that they were telling, there's a world-shaping egg in it of supernatural origin, and Jaden just suggested that, well, perhaps this supernatural egg would just quite quickly be eaten by a lion. This sounds like the normal fun kind of, discussion that two friends would have discussing their favorite anime or video games, right? You're going along with what the world says and the rules of the world and just seeing if it makes sense, bouncing off the ideas. Totally get this. Dave, my co-host on Toast to Toast, do this all the time. So far, so good.
You can't just say
God
you
isn't
can't
as
just say
powerful
that.
the people killed Jesus, Schlatt.
Okay. The people killed Jesus is her response to her. Schlett, I guess, is his name. Trying to object that he didn't think that a lion was going to be able to destroy the world-killing egg. And Jaden, I think, an apt comparison, at least not a disrespectful one, was able to say, hey, divine beings, there's a history, whether it's historical or merely in literature, of a divine being like Jesus coming to earth and getting destroyed. And, the mortal creatures reckon him. So again, I think we're on side. I don't think she's going along with the Christian mythology at this point. So I don't think we have a problem here yet. Let me know in the chat. Is this problematic yet?
I cannot believe you just said that.
He got crucified.
You're bringing up the crucifixion of Jesus Christ in a debate.
That's my favorite part. You're bringing up the crucifixion, the crucifixion of Jesus. So I don't know how upset he really is if he doesn't know the word crucifixion of Jesus. I'm not sure how strong a Christian he is there, but again, I don't think Jaden was disrespectful. She was within light of one mythology to another. Mortal creatures can destroy a divine creature. That's been established. All right, and then he gets upset. It goes off the rails from here.
You think God is this? Oh, no one can kill God.
What happened to him 3 days later?
He ran away like a little bitch.
He came back.
Oops. All right. So the co-host was going to maybe counter. Well, the humans didn't really destroy him. He rose 3 days later, and that was going to be his counterpoint to lions killing this egg. No, but she went a different way. According to Jaden, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Jesus ran away like a little bitch. Her words. All right.
To life.
He ran away, back up to God. Wham, wham. I couldn't fight the humans.
They sent flood.
All right. This is, again, keep in mind that this is a fun podcast talking about games and that kind of thing. But in her headcanon about how Jesus, what happened to Jesus, the humans killed him, and he tucked tail and went back to heaven and basically went to daddy and was upset that obviously his soul didn't die at this point in her version of the story. But rather than fight back like she imagined that a divine being would do, this divine being was just defeated, took his ball and went home. Interesting take on the mythology. I mean, in the context, it makes sense.
They sent pestilence. They sent locusts.
Well, we're
So now he's conflating all this stuff. So he seems to be indicating that he thinks that the humans caused the floods and the plagues and the pestilence. Of course, that was God sending all those things, as Jaden rightfully recognizes.
still here. Where's
You
God?
can fuck up every human if you...
Jaden. Yeah, God sent all these things. And in her discussion about whether, in the story of mortals versus immortals, even in the Bible, hey, humans are still standing. You sent the flood. You sent the pestilence. We're still here. God doesn't defeat us. We're still standing.
You're a god. If you're
Where's
God,
God, Schlatt? The humans are here. Where's God? He's still scared.
he's not scared. God is not scared.
Yes.
You should be scared of God. He's coming back soon. You ever heard of the rapture?
Define the rapture.
It's when God is going to come back and judge the living and the dead.
When's he coming back?
Some people say soon.
How long have they been saying soon?
Thousands of years, maybe. I don't know. It's been, Earth has been around for a while.
Well, the lions are only.
All right, and then they return to their discussion of whether lions can eat these divine eggs. All right, so I found that highly amusing. Again, I think it's not going to take many decades for Marvel Comics or somebody to start treating Jesus mythology in the same way that they treat Norse mythology or Greek mythology, the way Disney does with Hercules, etc. And that it will become acceptable to talk about these Christian stories as if they were myths and take artistic liberties among them. And it's not an uncharitable description of the stories from her perspective. So anyway, the Christians want to cancel Jaden Animation. This was a couple of weeks ago now. I was on the road when that happened, so I haven't... It seems like Christians are still quite angry at this video. A bunch of responses are happening. But it seems like Jaden is going to be okay. Quite a large channel. Anyway, so if you support Jaden, if you think that was funny, I think it was hilarious and great banter. I don't think it was disrespectful to the Bible, frankly. Her whole point was that in the Christian narrative, sometimes humans can foil God's plans, and that's absolutely true. God didn't want to flood the world. He didn't want us to eat, from the fruit of good and evil, all these kind of things. So I think the Christians are overreacting here, and they're upset for no reason. Let me know what you think in the comments. All right, moving on. This isn't the last one, but it is the big one. I know it's something you guys have all been waiting for. We're going back to Jenny, the high school teacher who teaches, we are hoping, but we don't know for sure, teaches in a Christian high school where she teaches apologetics to 10th and 11th graders, I believe. And she is taking TikTok, walking us along with her every day as she teaches in school, as she teaches through a book called 7 Reasons to Trust the Bible. Now, you'll have to see the other parts. I've created a playlist on this channel. You can see part 1 and part 2. Now we are going to check out part 3, prophecy.
I've been teaching through 7 reasons why you can trust the Bible in my Bible class. Reason number 3 is fulfilled prophecy. We began approaching
Fulfilled prophecy. All right.
the topic of prophecy by looking at a false prophet.
Okay, so she didn't start it off by defining prophecy or talking about what prophecy is. She walked into class, said, reason number 3, you can trust the Bible, is fulfilled prophecy. And the way I want to do that is to talk to you about people who are not good at prophecy and are not in the Bible. That would be a false prophet, right? False prophet. There are no false prophets in the Bible as far as you be concerned. Again, imagine if I was trying to investigate whether my local friend Sam was reliable at fixing cars. And you know what? How we're going to decide if Sam can fix cars is we're going to talk about how Bill can't fix cars. Would the fact that Bill can't fix cars in any way tell me that Sam can fix cars? No. But okay, Jenny, let's roll with it. Let's see how the existence of false prophets proves that there are real prophets.
Nostradamus was a 16th century soothsayer who studied the occult, who said that he would sit on top of a tripod with
Nostradamus, in case I stepped on that a little bit, is who she's talking about.
his spine totally straight until he fell into a trance, would stare into a bowl of boiling water, and in the steam and the vapors that arose, he would see the future.
I had not heard that about Nostradamus until just today. But okay, if Nostradamus was using natural phenomenon of steam, or perhaps there was some other hallucinogens involved, who knows? I don't know. That's kind of cool. But if that's his process, so be it. I'm not still unsure how this relates to the Bible, but let's go.
Wrote these predictions down in 1,000 quatrains, or 4 lines of verse. Even though he died in 1566, people are still fascinated with his predictions, even though it has taken many reinterpretations, not to mention a lively imagination to see how they all fit. But
This is ironic and delicious because we know that she is going to want to somehow apply this Nostradamus situation to biblical prophecy. And yet she is scoffing and laughing that, well, sometimes you have to be really imaginative to see how the connections work. Or that that it's kind of dubious or sketchy in order for these prophecies to work. Now, I think it's a good time here. I talked about this in my most recent video, the one about Greg Kokel and Eric Hovind, where we were talking about my criteria that I use. If you want to convince me that a prophecy is a divine prophecy, these are the 6 things that you'd have to show me. I think that everyone has different criteria, but I think these are reasonable. And I don't see why Christians would have a problem with these. Now, so first, that the prophecy was made clearly and demonstrably prior to the events predicted. So again, to be clear, in case you're not familiar with the Christian word prophecy, or just prophecy in general, Jenny at least is using it in terms of future telling. Accurate predictions of the future. So, 1, yeah, the prediction has to have happened before the event. No brainer, right? Number 2, that it was intended to be a prediction. We'll get into that more, why that's relevant. Again, sometimes, for example, The Simpsons have told stories about the future, and some of the things, for example, they predict in there. They had a story at one point where Disney bought Fox. I don't think they were intending it to be a prediction, They weren't clearly doing so, but it did come to pass. Number 3, a non-mundane claim. So, for example, predicting that next week we'll have a Wednesday. Not particularly great. 4, answerable only by a single clear, verifiable occurrence. Frankly, I could be a little bit more flexible on the single and clear if I could at least get to verifiable. So it's tough for me to get excited about a prediction coming true. For example, if I said, hey, I predicted earlier that a dragon would be in my yard, and then tomorrow I told you, well, there was a dragon in my yard, so now I'm a prophet. And you might likely say, can we see proof of the dragon first before I get excited about your future telling skills? Seems reasonable, right? Number 5, not open to interpretation. Now, I understand that almost anything, this is a tough one, but I'm meaning like not open, I don't need to be imaginative, as Jenny said, right? I shouldn't need to do that. And number 6, not something people are actively attempting to fulfill. So there are a lot of times where someone makes such a loud prediction and they are in a position of power that people are actually actively trying to make it happen. So let's say, for example, that Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, made a prediction that they would have a certain product out by a certain time. There are thousands of people who work for Apple who are actively attempting to make that fulfillment happen, right? So it's less a prediction and more setting a goal. So one of the things in this category is the reestablishment of Israel as a nation. There were millions of people around the world actively trying to make that happen in order to seem like some prophecy was fulfilled. So again, that's one that doesn't count. Bit of a sidetrack, but I think it's good to get my ground rules on the table, and perhaps you might adopt them or not. It's up to you. For me to be impressed by prophecy, this is something in the realm of where we need to go. Okay, Jenny?
You've got to be generous enough to admit that some of his predictions did at least partly come true. But
okay, so she's granting that some Nostradamus predictions came true. I'm not even sure. Now, I'm not a student of Nostradamus, so I'm not even sure that I would say that Nostradamus necessarily had too many of these that were very clearly came true, right? But probably someone in the chat can correct me about that. Probably there's some very clear-cut Nostradamus examples. That doesn't matter because we're going to a weird place.
Unaided human reason cannot predict the future.
Unaided human reason can occasionally make accurate predictions. So, for example, myself and 30 other people, we could each make a prediction about who will win the Super Bowl next year, right? We could each take a different team, and we will make our prediction about who will win. I forget how many teams they have, but it's ballpark that many. One of us will accurately predict this. That doesn't mean anything supernatural happened. It just means that, by sheer number and understanding how events happen, like I could predict that there will be a hurricane in Nova Scotia at some point in this calendar year. Well, boom, right? Because I could even make some more predictions about what part of the province and, from what direction. Like, these are just things that are not, they don't require supernatural explanations for occasionally to someone to predict the future. The Simpsons predict a lot of things. Look it up.
Got his information from one of two sources, either God or Satan.
All right, this is where Jenny's going. Nostradamus, when he got things right, this is her dichotomy. Either God told Nostradamus or Satan told Nostradamus. Those are the only two options on Jenny's plate at this point. Again, high school teacher teaching students how to think about the Bible. Great news, everyone.
How can we know that it wasn't from God? Well, first,
and it just wasn't God. We just know. So Satan told Nostradamus what to predict.
First of all, he violated the teaching of God's word to shun astrology. It says in Isaiah chapter 47, verses 12 through 14, "Stand now with thine enchantments and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth, if so be that thou shalt be able to profit, if so be thou mayest prevail, thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators, that is what that word says.
So Jenny, I don't vocabulary shame. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but Jenny is a high school teacher teaching her students specifically about prophecy. She planned a lesson plan. This is her job. This is what she does. She stumbled over the word prognostication. Prognosticators, I forget which iteration of it she was there. And she doesn't seem to know what that word means. Now, if you don't know what that word means, that's fine as well. But prognostication is literally just telling the future. It's someone making a prediction. It is virtually synonymous with the word prophecy. So, good job, high school teacher Jenny. Our future is in good hands.
Stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. Behold, they shall be as stubble. The fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor fire to sit before it. Since Nostradamus was getting his predictions from astrology, at least in
Nostradamus correctly, in Jenny's view, predicted some things. The only options, so it's Satan from, it's either God or Satan. It seems like Nostradamus may have taken inspiration from celestial signs, therefore astrology. And therefore, Jenny, keep in mind, let's back all this up. Jenny's point here is to show us that the Bible is reliable. Is Nostradamus related to the Bible? No. Nope. Doesn't matter. Proving if Nostradamus did predict the future accurately, would that say anything about the Bible? No. If he was not doing it, would it say anything about the Bible? No. Doesn't matter. But Jenny is saying that because Nostradamus used the stars for inspiration for some of his predictions, and because the Bible says, the Bible that is the question, is it reliable or not? The Bible says astrology is not of God. Therefore, her class can just go ahead and assume that Nostradamus was in league with Satan. Like, you can't... The point is to prove whether the Bible is reliable or not. Jenny, in order to make this point, is assuming the Bible is reliable about what it says about the stars. This is... It's not directly circular, but it is directly circular, if you think about it. So I'm very concerned about this class and what they're learning.
part, we can know that it was not from God. But another reason that we can know that he was not...
We don't care if it's from God here, Jenny. What we care about is, are there people foretelling the future in a way that cannot be explained naturally, that is so accurate, and so these 6 points line up so much that only a supernatural explanation can happen. That's all that matters. And is the Bible of such of things? It doesn't matter if Nostradamus had 1,000% batting average on being correct. That still doesn't tell us about the Bible. It tells us nothing. This false prophet notion, all it tells us is that Nostradamus didn't have a supernatural connection, or if he did, you think he did. That his supernatural connection wasn't your favorite supernatural connection. It's the one you don't like. We are so off base here.
Not getting his prophecy from God was that he was often wrong. The Bible tells us that if a prophet is wrong even one time, he needs to be marked as a false prophet. In Deuteronomy 18:20, it actually says to stone him. Then if you will read...
So modern day Christians don't follow this, of course, because there have been countless books. I would say almost one per year since in my longer than I would like to admit lifetime, that someone puts out a book as to I distinctly remember the 88 reasons why God will come in 1988. And then it got revised to, 89 reasons why he'll come in 89. And, in the 90s there were some, and in the 2000s there were some. In 2012 there was a plethora of these. Like, so many of God's prophets have been wrong, and I don't remember any of them being stoned. But also, I seem to recall Jesus making a prophecy that I would interpret to mean that that he would come back before all the disciples died. Before everyone in that room passed away, he was coming back. Although I guess Jesus did get himself killed, so maybe that punishment sorted itself out. I don't know.
Read the verses in Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. It tells you that an accurate, isolated prediction does not in itself prove the validity of a prophet.
Okay. Interesting. So Jenny's putting out there that prophecies, even accurate prophecies, don't guarantee anything. So I don't know, even if we eventually are going to get to the Bible, I hope, from this Bible class. According to the Bible, accurate prophecies about the future aren't necessarily divine. It might be of Satan. So if we point some out, if Jenny points out some accurate prophecies, we're not even supposed to attribute those to God necessarily. So this is a mess.
The enemy can absolutely provide information for people who are unwilling to submit to God.
Yes, that's right. All accurate predictions are either God or Satan. I forgot that. So if I predict, that Chicago wins the Super Bowl, and they do in the next 10 years, that obviously Satan told me.
While Satan is not omniscient, I think that he does have some access to the heavenly realm and information. You can gain a little bit more insight into what that might look like in the first chapter of Job. But I think that if the enemy tips somebody off on what might be happening or what he heard might be going down, that the Lord steps in and goes, well, it ain't now, just so that we know that that was a false prophet. Not.
So you think that every time, that would be a fun way for us to, speaking of, lions eating eggs and the mortals thwarting God's plans. So all we have to do collectively as a secular group is start predicting ways that God will work. And according to Jenny up there, God will deliberately change his plans so that our prophecy fails. So again, if you want God to not do something, just very publicly predict that he will, and he won't. And he won't do it to prove you wrong, because that's the kind of petty God Jenny serves.
Of God. I believe that's true based on Isaiah chapter 44, verses 24 through 25. Read those verses and see that God is not going to share his glory, and he's going to make it known that he is God.
Again, just remember the enterprise we're in here. Jenny's trying to prove that the Bible's reliable, and the way she wants to do that is have you read a bunch of passages assuming that they're already assuming that they're reliable, with no falsification criteria whatsoever. That's just where we're at on this. By the third week into this course, we've given up all pretense.
In contrast, biblical prophecy is clear, because if God is God, then his prophets can write about the future with the same confidence that historians write about the past. For God, the future is the past. I'll share examples of some fulfilled prophecy in the next video.
Boom. All right. So we're going to get to that. We're doing both parts here today. Jenny has shown that Nostradamus, in her own way, according to the Bible, Nostradamus was a false prophet, even though he was sometimes right. And the way we know that is because he admitted to using the stars and that he was sometimes wrong. Now, I'm not sure that he made any predictions so specifically that we can actually say that Nostradamus was absolutely wrong, that there was no possible way of interpreting, but fine, whatever. One failure means automatic failure, all fine. Just my point is, Nostradamus could have been the worst predictor of the future who ever lived, and that tells us nothing about the Bible. So boom, Jenny, good job. The next day, she posted a video about actually the biblical prophecy. Let's see how she fares against my 6 criteria.
7 reasons why you can trust the Bible. Reason number 3 is fulfilled Bible prophecy, and I'm about to give you some examples. First of all, Isaiah prophesied that the nation of Israel was going to be taken captive by Babylon.
Okay. So this is not surprising. She went straight to Isaiah. Now, here's the thing about it. I'm going to ramble a little bit about Isaiah. So first of all, Isaiah is widely accepted by Christian and non-Christian Old Testament scholars alike, be they Jewish, secular, Christian, whatever. Isaiah is pretty clearly 3 different books, either stitched together or just sold together. Isaiah is not one book. There's 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. All right? So it's not a single thing. That's a non-controversial topic. Now, here's what is controversial in its own way. When was Isaiah written, or more importantly, when were the various parts of Isaiah written? Now, if you want, I'm guessing that Jenny is going to say that she thinks that Isaiah was written around 800 BC. And I forget the exact dates, but it's around 800. I think it's some of these events that are described happened in the 700s BC, so I'm pretty sure that the faithful Christians think it was then. But here's the problem, and let me describe to you with analogy my understanding of the way scholars look at Isaiah. Or not even scholars, just if you read Isaiah yourself, how you'd see it. So imagine that you found a book today, that I handed you a book, and I said, this is a book written by George Washington, first president of the United States. Before his presidency even. This is the book written by George Washington, and in it, George Washington is going to predict the future. So there will be a few lines about the formation of America as a nation. Nothing specific, just general. Maybe a few lines about there being a civil war of sorts. Maybe. Some vague ideas about that at some point slaves will be freed. And then it will have not a lot of detail on that. And then it will have a very specific chapter later on about the election of a Catholic president who will be shot. And there's some extra details about that. And it even goes on to describe in its own way a notion that you can recognize as a car, even though, George Washington wouldn't have been super familiar with cars, obviously, or even know what the words for those are. But the word for car is in there, and it's getting pretty specific now. And then it gets really specific about an era where an actor becomes president. And in there is this great detail about the nation across the sea that didn't even exist yet at the time of George Washington, that they're about a Cold War and a lot of, and even space races and Star Wars and things like that. It's getting more and more detailed. And in the last chapter that I gave you, it describes President Trump in great detail. It lists his name, it lists his top advisors, by name, it describes in incredible detail all these things. And so the further in the future it gets away from George Washington, the more detailed it is. It's almost like the author of the book knows the events of the far future better than the author knows the things that are going to happen in the next couple of years. So I would hand you this book and say, well, yeah, George Washington wrote this, and it isn't amazing. The further he looked into the future, the more detailed he got. But no one has seen this book until now, but just trust me, George wrote it. Now, are you going to say, hey, Paul, absolutely, George Washington obviously wrote this, and look how accurate it was about the future? Or are you going to think, hey, maybe Paul wrote a book in the voice of George Washington, and because Paul knows the more recent events in far more detail than he knows the more ancient events. The ancient stuff is vague, and the more current stuff is super specific. And also even uses words that didn't exist at the time when George Washington is alleged to have wrote it. That is my analogy for Isaiah. Look, the prophecies, the so-called prophecies in that book, as I describe, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the chat, they get more and more specific the further in the future they get. Whereas the things in his contemporary times are vague. That's not the only reason people don't think Isaiah was written back in the time of Isaiah, because, again, it's using different styles and words and describes situations that just didn't exist and the prophets of Isaiah wouldn't have had access to. It's like if George Washington put the word dinosaur in his book, or the word vehicle or car. These are words, or email. These are words that came after him, right? So the most logical explanation on Isaiah is that all the prophecy stuff was written after the events happened. Now, that's not satisfying to a Christian, but all signs for someone like me point to that's what happened. And not just because that would mean the prophecy is true, but linguistically, just the nature of the prophecies getting more and more detailed. I'm making whole videos on this at some point. Isaiah is not good prophecy. It does not. If we're going to go back to my points, it fails on number one. It is not made clearly and demonstrably prior to the events predicted. In fact, it seems almost certain that it was written afterwards as a historian, writing it from their perspective. So, if Christians want to be comforted by this, great. But you're not going to prove that the Bible is reliable by counting on these passages.
Isaiah wrote between 700 and 680 BC.
No. Okay, so I was actually no. But so it is broadly thought that large chunks of Isaiah were written, like second and third Isaiah, I guess. Forgive me if I'm not getting this exactly right. In the 400s or 500s BC, like after the events happened.
He wrote this in Isaiah chapter 39, verses 5 and 6. Then said Isaiah to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days come that all that is in thine house, and that which thy fathers have laid up in store until this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. That was a crazy thing to predict because Babylon was barely coming into its own at the time. This prediction...
Yeah, that's why I was using the Soviet Union in my little analogy I was making up off the top of my head there, because, again, George Washington wouldn't have been able to predict that the Soviet Union was a power. So it is similar. And again, but it kind of points to, again, the notion that perhaps he would have used other words for this, for Babylon, if that's what he really meant.
Was fulfilled 100 years later in 3 stages, culminating together in the siege of 586 BC. Then Isaiah goes on to predict that Persia was going to come and take over Babylon, which was also crazy because Persia was barely in existence. But he goes on to predict that Persia would become a world power and that the king of Persia was going to allow the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. And he names him. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1, he says, Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him, and on and on. That would be...
Again, the predictions get more and more specific the further in the future they go, per the explanation I've already given.
Like predicting 150 years from now the name of the President of the United States and also naming his main foreign domestic policy. Because Isaiah predicted this while he was writing between 700 and 680 BC, and Cyrus wasn't even born yet, began to rule over the Persians in 559 BC. We see the fulfillment of this prophecy in Ezra 1:1. Which says, Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith the king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So he sends the Jews back to Jerusalem, and they begin the rebuilding of the temple, and that's what we see in the book of Nehemiah. Everybody...
Yeah. And so once the Second Temple period begins, these legends and these stories start to talk. So I think my preamble kind of covered all that. I don't need to cover all that. Suffice to say, Jenny and I are not going to agree on whether this was written before the fact or after the fact. If you could establish clearly that it was before the fact, maybe you'd have something, although there's a lot of figurative language in there as well. I feel like there's a lot of interpretation even. So, nevertheless, what else do you got?
In secular history agrees that the founder of the Persian Empire was Cyrus, and that he ruled over the Persians from 559 BC to 530 BC. Open your Bibles to these passages and write the prophecy that was prophesied and write when it was fulfilled next to it.
And write when it was written next to that, because generally, at least in these stretches, when it was written is almost certainly after the prophecy happened. So put both those dates in your Bible if you're defacing it.
Done so in my Bible as I've been teaching through this. And also, let me just say that sticky notes on the pages of Scripture are underrated. I have sticky
I forgot that was in there. Yeah, so Jenny's advocating that you get the pages of your Bible sticky. That if you so this is if you have to have sticky pages in the Bible, this is probably the best way to do that.
sticky notes that have been stuck in my Bible for over 20 years.
Some of the pages of Jenny's Bible have been stuck together for 20 years now.
Share another fulfilled prophecy in the next video.
All right. So that was part 3 of Jenny's 7 reasons that the Bible is reliable. Now, in the weeks that I've been kind of off, she's been able to work ahead. So there's several of the parts. Don't look ahead. Several of the parts are ready. So next time we will be going on to part number 4. I'm excited about it as we get this saga. And as I said, people seem to be enjoying it, so I'll be clipping this one out as well, and we'll be having a playlist. So, hey, here's a recording for me to insert earlier. If you want to follow the Jenny saga from the beginning, tap on the link above my head, and you can go to the full playlist. But not while we're live, because that's silly. That's something I'm going to have to put in later. All right, everyone. We are down to one last video to go today. This one is from Inspiring Philosophy. And Mike Jones, friend of the channel, fan of his TikToks, and we've had discussions both online and off many times. Like the guy, but he and I will always disagree on the notion of divine hiddenness. So it caught my attention when he was on Pints with Aquinas discussing that very thing, divine hiddenness. Let's brace ourselves. What does Mike have to say about my favorite topic, or the topic about God which influenced me the most?
How do you respond to the hiddenness of God? This argument, and I'm not going to get. You can still man it for me, but the idea being, if God exists and wants me to be saved, and I need to accept that salvation in some capacity, then I need to first at least know that he exists.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is an important point. And when I had my recent conversation with Kurt Jarris, for example, I was trying to establish this. So most Christians, while they disagree on a great many things, when they think about it, will agree with me that there are at least 2 parts to God's salvation plan for his believers. So, first of all, you have to get some kind of intellectual assent to something. Now, Christians will disagree, but there needs to be some kind of intellectual assent, at very least, that God exists, and that this God has authority over us in some way, and that we've wronged that God in some way. There needs to be, step 1, intellectual assent. Step 2, some kind of heart/mind, emotional life response to that. So there's the intellectual assent. And that's not enough, but it is a prerequisite. Part 2 is a response, a personal response to that intellectual idea. So because of this 2-step system, no person can merely accept, they can't jump to step 2, right? You need the intellectual assent, you need the intellectual acknowledgement before you can respond. So if anyone like out there is like me, for whom it does not seem like a God exists, I don't believe a God exists, I believe the Christian God does not exist, depending on how you want to label it, I am not at the intellectual assent part. Therefore, I'm not even capable of doing step 2, right? Until I reach that intellectual assent, I can't accept or reject God. That's an important part. So if this God wants to have a relationship with me, and even worse, if this God is intending to base my eternal fate on my emotional response to the intellectual assent, I need to at least have the intellectual assent. So the idea of the argument from divine hiddenness is that if there are non-resistant non-believers, meaning a non-believer who would move on to phase 2 if they could get to phase 1, if there's even a single person like that in the world, in the history, for whom, if they had the intellectual assent, would make the appropriate response, then God has created a problem. Then we do not have a God that is all benevolent, or we do not have a God that wants to save me. There's some flaw in a God that would allow that scenario, that would seem to negate the descriptions of the Christian God, okay? And that's where I am at on divine hiddenness. I've examined myself as far as I can tell about myself. I am a non-resistant non-believer. I was a believer. I wanted to stay a believer. My faith was ripped from me against my will. I am open. If I come to once again believe that the Christian God exists, I will immediately follow. I will immediately accept whatever minor lifestyle changes that involves for me. No worries. That's a small sacrifice for me for this eternal life. So I am boldly putting myself in that non-resistant non-believer camp. Therefore, for me, and for me only, because no one else can psychoanalyze me, know my heart, know my mind, for me, that is sufficient evidence to say that the Christian God does not exist. It's not proof for you, it's not proof for anyone else, but it's proof enough for me. That's background.
And yet there are atheists who really would believe in Jesus Christ and God if they could.
Would they?
I don't want to step on Mike's response there. Mike's response to that question was, would they? So the Pints from Aquinas host, whose name I unfortunately don't remember, laid out what I just laid out in a more succinct fashion. Mike said, would they? But look what's on the clip sponsored by Covenant Eyes. Just in case anyone doesn't know what Covenant Eyes is, Covenant Eyes is software that reports to other people, often your pastor or your spouse or your promise keeper type thing. There's, what do we call them? Accountability partners of various sorts. If you look at the porn, if you're looking at websites or videos or apps that would be causing you to fall into sin, then the Covenant Eyes software, you basically install malware on your own devices that has unremovable access to monitor all of your internet, and you do this voluntarily, and then it will report to a select group of people all the stuff you're doing. So that's neat. That's a real thing. I didn't realize that Covenant Eyes was still going. It was a thing, I don't know, 10 years ago, that just from a software perspective, handing that much power over to some third-party software on your computer is a bad idea. I don't care about the ethics of the rest of it. It's just a bad idea. Anyhow, that's what Covenant Eyes is. But let's get back to Mike, who denies that such a person would even exist.
I mean,
there's something we don't know how to. How could you can't answer that?
You can't answer that. Yeah. I mean, human psychology is so complex. When an atheist tells me, if you just gave me the evidence, I'd believe, I go, uh-huh. That's not how your brain works. That's not how we work as humans. That's just.
So keep in mind, divine hiddenness is not about whether all people would choose to believe. Yeah, if they were given sufficient evidence. It's about, are there any or even one that would give the proper heart response, proper meaning what God would wish, if given enough evidence. What Mike seems to be doing is painting with a broad brush that, in general, people don't change their mind because of evidence. Therefore, God is not complicit in these cases.
This isn't the way it is. Flat earthers exist. Okay? Yeah. The evidence the earth is round is there, and there's people who don't believe it.
Fine. Again, that's not the argument, because that would be a resistant non-believer, right? And we know that there are people who are resistant to any idea. You name the idea, there is someone who is resistant to believing it. Fair enough. The question is, so even with the flat earth crowd, Mike, I know of flat earthers who eventually, despite great resistance, did come to accept the evidence. In fact, the whole planet at one point had to go from believing in flat earth to believing in round earth. They overcame it. There are modern day flat earthers who come to accept the evidence. I know some have even gone up in the big balloons and they're like, oh, look what happened, the weather balloons. And like, oh yeah, it's a sphere after all. Yeah, believe it. The fact that some people remain resistant tells us nothing about this divine hiddenness scenario.
Don't give me this nonsense that if I just gave you the evidence, you'd change your worldview. We know from studying the brain that when your beliefs are attacked, even little beliefs, the lizard part of your brain lights up. Flight or flight response. I've been doing
yeah, that's just being resistant. But there is always an amount of evidence. For any true proposition, there is always a hypothetical amount of evidence that will overcome your lack of evidence, your disbelief, right? There, just, it doesn't matter. If I'm just looking over at my dog there, if I'm completely of the belief that my dog is a dog, but in fact that is not the case, my dog is some sort of other animal, there is some hypothetical amount of evidence that a vet I could look at x-rays, or they could be genetic tests, something. I could be convinced, despite the fact that's a very weird idea, that my dog isn't actually a canine, right? That there is an amount of evidence that can make someone believe a true proposition. Now, God is choosing not to provide that for everyone. I don't know why. I don't know why it's a two-step process. But the first step's not up to me, because I don't choose my beliefs, nor does anyone. It doesn't matter whether I'm resistant or not. There is an amount of evidence that will overcome it.
Experiment for years now with a stupid issue that I've been dealing with. It's called, is Christmas pagan? There is no evidence any aspect of Christmas is pagan. There is none. Every time I say that, and
Mike is the kind of person that gets upset when people say there is no evidence for God. And I think that is a mistake when an atheist says there's no evidence for God, when what they mean is there's insufficient evidence, or there's no evidence that that you consider to be compelling, blah, blah, blah. That, there is some evidence that Christmas is pagan. even if it's just the claim that people make. If you want to say that claims are evidence, you've made videos about this. The claim that Christmas is pagan must be on your scale, at least, some level of evidence for it. I'm not getting into that fight right now. I just think, Mike, you probably made a mistake by saying there's no evidence for it. You're saying there's no good evidence for it. There's no compelling evidence. Fine. And actually, for the record, Mike is the one who convinced me that what we recognize as modern day Christmas is not specifically of pagan origin. And so I actually changed my mind on that. Again, I have no horse in the race, don't really care. I just think Christmas is cool, so whatever. Don't care if it's pagan or Christian. But Mike, you've changed my mind on that, and I'm in your camp, and I love it when you make those videos, so it's possible, with enough evidence, to change minds. I know you're going to bring up examples of people that refuse to, but that doesn't have any impact on whether I am convinced or whether other people are convinced.
I have every single source I need to prove that. I can prove that from here to Tuesday. Every time I bring it up, there is somebody in the comment section, no, you're wrong, this guy's a moron, isn't what we're talking about. I've gotten in long comment threads where I go through and I'm citing, here's what the Philo-Kalian calendar says, here's what Macrobius says, here's what the earliest texts on Yule logs are, and there's no evidence Yule logs go back to paganism. I can show you the first reference to a Yule log and John Aubrey's work, okay? They still don't believe me. You know what it tells me? It doesn't matter how much evidence I give people Christmas isn't pagan, they're still going to believe it because they want to.
No. What that shows you is that some people will not believe it based on the level of evidence that you have given. And maybe even based on the level of evidence that actually exists. There may be a gap between the evidence that exists and what would convince them. Doesn't mean that hypothetically there couldn't be enough evidence. Just means in practicality there's not. You are making a huge jump to say that because some people won't believe based on the evidence that you have available, that no one will believe based on the evidence available, or that there's not even a hypothetical amount of evidence that would cause them to believe. That is a bridge too far, my friend.
Now take it with something that's much more life-changing, some more fundamental, more impactful, like Christianity. You really think something that's more threatening to the way people live they're gonna change just if I give them the evidence?
You're describing a resistant believer, a resistant non-believer, pardon me. Fine, yeah, there's going to be people who don't want Christianity to be true for all kinds of reasons, maybe good, maybe bad, doesn't matter. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, is there hypothetically in all of history one non-resistant non-believer? And for this argument you're making to be told true, there's not a single person in history that isn't resisting, that isn't already Christian, that isn't resisting it in some way. That is some psychoanalysis.
That's how people are.
It's like abortion. I mean, before modern sonograms, people would say it's not human, it's not a life, and then you would, as the science developed, you were able to show very clearly, look at its heartbeat, look at its brain, look at how it acts.
And people tell me it's a clump of cells.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's not the same at all. Not the same at all. So, because what you're talking about is a definitional difference, because it can be alive, it can be human in that it has human DNA, and it can also still be a lump of cells. So those three things can all be true at the same time. You are imbuing the word human with more than that other person is. So you are having a definitional debate, my friend. You are not having a conflict of someone who accepts evidence and someone who doesn't. You need to get your terms straight, because pro-choice people aren't debating whether cells are alive in the biological definitional sense. I'm not going to get into all that now. They're not debating what the chromosomes are. Again, that's a terrible example. Terrible example.
Ridiculous. It doesn't matter how much evidence you show people. And this has been shown in psychology. I remember reading a study one time where they had two groups. One group, they asked, what do you prefer, home care or daycare? So group A said home care. Group B said daycare. Then they gave them each 2 fake studies. One study showed how good home care was, and one study showed how good daycare was. And the people in the first group that preferred home care said, oh, they used reasoning to dismiss the daycare study. They looked for things to dismiss it. Same thing in the other group. They did look for things to dismiss them. People build their worldviews.
That example tells me nothing at all about divine hiddenness, because you are positing that there, if you want to make it that analogy, that there are literally no people that are ambivalent between home care and daycare, or whatever the two, between one type and another. So, for example, there are people just there's literally no human who's ever not made up their mind and are willing to just look at both study and see which is best. You are positing that everyone has an opinion so entrenched on this home style, the school style, that they have to be in one camp or other. No, you just picked things that people already feel strongly about, and said therefore there cannot even exist someone who doesn't feel strongly. These are not analogous.
We all do it. We need to recognize this is the way we are, because the first step to realizing we have a problem is accepting it. we all want our worldviews, the beliefs we currently espouse, to be true, because the lizard part of our brain.
That may well be, but for some of us, you just said we all want our worldviews to be correct. Some of us were willing to make sacrifices to change our worldview when shown that they are incorrect. Probably everyone watching this, everyone watching the original video Mike did, in some aspect of their life, made a change of their opinion against what they wanted based on new facts. For example, I didn't want to have cancer. And yet, when I was shown the x-rays and the tests and the blood work, all that kind of stuff, showing that I did have cancer, guess what? Against what I wanted, I accepted that I had cancer. That's not for pity. That is just me saying, good grief. We prefer... there is levels of evidence so that you will change your worldview to be correct. The fact that we would prefer to be correct in the first place says nothing about it.
It's up and we go, I don't want to be wrong on something. That's what I was telling myself when I took down my Exodus documentary and had to redo it. An hour-long documentary I uploaded. I was like, I cannot be given to my lizard brain. I know this is true about myself. I know I want it to be true, and I could...
Okay, so Mike is literally describing a scenario where he desperately wanted to be right. He'd gone out publicly and put forth a documentary that contained what he later learned to be false information. He accepted that the information he was putting out was incorrect and took painful steps to correct it. So he's giving a counterexample to his own proposal.
Easily make the evidence fit, but I know I got to do what's right. And that was hard. I mean, I literally cried. So, I mean,
It doesn't matter that it's hard. The fact that it's hard doesn't make it impossible. The fact that it's hard just means that it's hard. So, yeah, so that actually is going to come into some of these extraordinary claims type scenarios where people, they're going to need information sufficient to not only change what they already accept, but what they want. But that's always hypothetically possible for any true proposition. And surely God can clear this first step, given that it doesn't actually affect who gets into heaven or not. We all know the first step gets us nowhere, but the first step is a prerequisite. So why even have this first step? Why not be as plain as the sun? Obviously, there's probably people up there who deny the existence of the sun. I don't know. But most people will accept that there is a sun. Why can't God be as plain as that?
know what it's like, but that's the way humans are. So when you tell me you just give me enough evidence, I'll believe. I'm like, you're a human, man. That's not the way we work.
It is the way some humans work. You just described yourself doing it.
I will give you the evidence and I will argue this is true. But people will not, if people do not want Christianity to be true, they will not.
That is literally a resistant non-believer. You've just qualified that the people you're talking to are resistant. And you are somehow saying by the existence of some people who you can identify as resistant, therefore there has never in the history of humanity not been a non-resistant person. That is a bold claim, my friend. Bold claim.
Accept it. And I believe it was it Pascal who said it? You know, like there's enough evidence out there for anybody who's willing to say that, yes, this could be true. And but it's not forced upon us. It's not.
There's enough evidence for me to say that Christianity could be true. I don't think, but it's not enough for me to say that it is true. There's a huge difference there. And so your Pascal wager to get me to the point that it's maybe, the fact that your maybe isn't sufficient for me to say yes, that's not on me.
Not like in your face kind of thing.
Yeah, enough light for those.
And I think
to
that's
seek
just
it and
the
find
genius
it, yeah.
of God. It's there if you want to come to me, but it's not going to.
It's not genius, because this is a two-step process, and we've at least demonstrated the immense possibility that people are being prevented from taking the second step because through no fault of their own they can't get onto the first step. That is not a plan of a loving God who wants to have a relationship with me. Fine, if the actual God that created the universe doesn't want to have a relationship with me for whatever reason, or is willing to let me suffer, even though in the Bible, Jesus talks about a parable of, man, if I will leave the 99 sheep and go seek out the one, just, because every single individual is so important. And yet when it comes to this divine hiddenness, it's some kind of nuanced theodicy numbers game that doesn't help the non-resistant non-believer. They're still screwed. Whatever hell is, that's where they're going.
People have changed their minds over facts.
Yeah.
Things that they didn't want to be true.
You just gave an example.
You're not saying don't give people arguments.
No, give people arguments for sure. But I mean, just accept that if they're not open, they're going to find any way they can to dismiss it.
Yeah, that's a resistant non-believer. Again, you can give a million examples of people who are resistant. That doesn't rule out the existence of a non-resistant non-believer, Mike.
I got to accept I may be doing that the same.
Exactly. I was about to say that. It obviously cuts both ways.
It
there
does.
are Christians who might say, give me the evidence and I'll become an atheist. And you'd say exactly the same thing, presumably.
I mean, yeah. And you know what?
Yeah, and the existence of such people, I know people like that who've, there's a person in my life who literally has begged me not to give them evidence against God because they are afraid that they will stop being Christian. So I honor that. That's fine. That person is a resistant believer, right? But I'm not walking around saying because there's a handful of people resistantly believing that there's no such thing as a Christian who can stop believing. Because I was one. I wanted to keep believing.
I'm a theistic evolutionist. And you know what happened was an atheist online said,
Don't tell Mike Winger about this. We covered that earlier. He doesn't believe you.
If you were, could you just look at this a little more objectively? Like, the same thing earlier, a few years ago, a Christian told me to do with the Gospels. And I was like, oh, that hit me hard. And I was like, all right, I will. So I read Jerry Coyne. I read some, I'm like, you know what? I guess I'm convinced. And this is just the way it is.
So wait, Mike, you described something that you didn't want to be true. You didn't want evolution to be true. You were actively resistant to it, but you went and you sought the information, and the information was sufficient to overcome your resistance to it, and you ultimately accepted it. You've given your own counterexample. I didn't need any of my examples. You, Mike, are the example of these exceptions. Even if they're rare exceptions, they exist. Now, point that back to the whole eternal soul fate question. I don't see how you can insist that there's no one like you, that you're a special snowflake, that only you are open to evidence, and because you already accept God, that even this doesn't apply to you somehow. I don't understand how someone smart like you can hold this position on divine hiddenness. Maybe you'll have to explain it to me where I'm missing it, because I don't see it.
And Christians today still attack me for it.
So you
Maybe I'm resistantly holding on to my non-resistant non-belief.
you denied evolution and then changed your mind on it. I
Yeah.
see. Yeah.
And yeah, every time I got to change my worldview, it hurts. It hurts my brain.
Yeah, it hurts, but that doesn't mean you don't do it, and that doesn't mean it's impossible.
I don't want to accept I'm wrong on something. You know, the video I'm taking, I'll take it down. I just keep delaying it because I hate myself for being wrong on something. But I'm going to redo it in June, and I just hate the fact that I was wrong on something. But I mean, here's another thing I got to fix.
And yet, clearly, God's existence could be more evident.
Could be.
Good question.
Isn't. And that's not a problem because
Because the earth is round and people still don't believe it. Look.
But are there people that are open to the earth being round who don't believe it? Because that's the analogy. What you need to show me, Mike, is that there are people who are willing for the earth to be round and yet can't be convinced for this to be analogous. Because the level of evidence for God isn't comparable to the evidence for the earth being round. Until you can show me that there are, these en masse, these swaths of people wishing for a globe earth, but they just can't get there.
God could show up in some people's, people like Aaron Ra, Matt Dillon have said these kinds of similar things. Like, if God, people have asked them, if God appeared before you, would you believe in God? And they've said things like, no, I could be hallucinating.
Yeah.
Again, people.
Yeah, that's the rational answer. If something like a God appears to you and you don't at least consider for 1 minute that might be a hallucination rather than actual vertical experience, then you are not doing yourself a service in any way. If you are going to take every hallucination on board as veridical, no wonder it makes me scared for you that you do believe in God. That perhaps your reasons for doing this are terrible. You need to suspect that experience is a hallucination. Maybe even just for a second. But that's why people ask me, if God appears to me, would I believe it? And I said, well, I would want this God experience to tell me something that I can go verify that I don't already know. Because, of course, a hallucination is going to know everything that I already know. So please, hallucination, just give me something I can go verify. Then I will be on board. If the God can show me something like that, can solve the math problem, it doesn't need to be as grand. That's my funny example, but if it can give me the answer to a math problem that's never been solved by the greatest mathematicians in the world, cool. But there's probably other things that I don't have firsthand knowledge of that it could go and point to me and for me to go verify. So that should be easy for a God. The fact that you might suspect that it's hallucination and that shows that you're resistant tells me that your standards are way off.
Will find excuses to believe what they want.
Mm-hmm.
That's not an excuse. It's not an excuse to want to have the most base level verification. That's just bare minimum skepticism.
I think, and some people will say, they'll say, no, if God did appear, I would believe. And I'm like, you might. That might be just another way.
If I might, then that grants that there is a non-resistant non-believer, and everything you've just said doesn't matter.
For you to tell yourself these relaxing things, could be, could not be. This could just be a way of you, trying to feel comfortable with yourself and not feel like you're, doing this.
You're just pretending to be intellectually honest. You're not really. Mike knows that I'm not really being intellectually honest. I'm just placating myself with platitudes, right? That's the psychoanalysis that's going on.
But then what advice would you give to the person who says, if there's arguments, I do want to change my mind? Presumably it's not, no, you wouldn't. So what?
The advice I give is this in talking to the person, accept that you won't. First of all, the first step is accepting that's just not who you are.
It is who I. How can you say that it's not who I am? I am incredibly happy for Christianity to be true. A lot of relationships in my life will get instantly better. My career opportunities will go through the roof if I come back to Christianity. The amount of speaking engagements, book deals. Look, you got your J. Warren Wallace's, your Lee Strobels, who again are examples of people who allegedly, if you believe their stories, overcome this stuff. My life will be so much better on so many fronts, not to mention the fact that I have then suddenly a paradise that is supposed to be great waiting for me. There's no sin I'm committing on the regular that I need to give up. There's just nothing in my life. There's no path. There's nothing I need to do. And my personal identity happens to align with things that are acceptable to Christians. So this is ridiculous. I have every reason to want to accept Christianity to be true, other than intellectual honesty.
That's not the way you think. That's not the way you are, except you have a problem.
You just know how I think. You just know who I am better than I am. Because of Romans 1:20, maybe? I don't know. Or because it would shatter your divine hiddenness argument? Maybe this is just maybe your denial of non-resistant non-believers, if I can throw it back. It's just your comfort way of saying your God obviously can't be a terrible person because there's no such thing as the hypothetical you're putting forth, even though you identify as one. You're just fooling yourself.
You do want all your current beliefs to be true. I want all my current beliefs to be true. I have to fight that every day.
I want to believe true things. I don't want what I believe to be true.
And I hope I'm getting better. I may not be. I hope, though. So just accept, first of all, that's not the way you think. And then try very, very hard. I mean, like very hard to just study the evidence objectively. Look at the Gospels with the principle of charity.
Which I have done.
Look at the evidence for the resurrection. I recommend Mike Lacona's book and the method.
Which I have read.
Methodology he uses on.
And interviewed him.
The resurrection. So he says, look, a theory to explain historical facts has got to have explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility.
First, we have to agree on which facts are to be explained before we can get into explanatory scope, explanatory power, because that's where Mike and I differ greatly. He thinks things are facts that I do not accept as facts. So we're not down to scope and power or plausibility.
Least ad hoc, provide illumination. The resurrection theory has all of that. It is the least ad hoc. It is the most plausible. It explains all the facts.
It is absolutely not most plausible if you have not already established that the supernatural exists. It is absolutely, it adds extra assumptions that a naturalistic explanation doesn't need. An naturalistic explanation doesn't need a God that works in the world in a way specifically to this Jewish carpenter. Those are a lot of layers that are incredibly implausible until you give me other evidence for other things.
On early Christianity with the least amount of assumptions.
No, sorry, I just jumped the gun on you there, but I know you have layered on so many assumptions for the resurrection hypothesis to be the simplest and the most plausible. I can't go there with you yet. We got some work to do before we jump into that.
It also has plausibility because it has evidence from other arguments for God's existence. I mean, you may come to a different conclusion. I'm going to disagree with you, but that's all I can do at the end of the day. I can't psychoanalyze you.
I can't psychoanalyze you, he says. For the last 8 minutes, what have you been doing? Other than psychoanalyzing swaths of people, the entire history of every human on the planet, you've psychoanalyzed to say that not a single one of them is non-resistant non-believer. And yet, in the end, we're coming down to it, and you say, you can't psychoanalyze people? Why stop now?
You can just present the evidence and say, this is why I think it's true, and we debate it. But try to look at the evidence as objectively as objectively as you can and accept that you can't. That's what we all have to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so just if you don't agree with Mike, then you can't. Then you're not impartial. Anyone who disagrees with me, not just you're lying to yourself. You just can't look at things anyway. Thank you for going through that with me. Divine hiddenness gets me heated. Divine hiddenness gets me passionate, and because for me, that is the single greatest evidence that the Christian God does not exist. Not just that I don't believe it, but the way Christians have described that God to me, that God does not want to have a relationship with me. And so if it's real, it actually doesn't matter because I'm just condemned to hell either way. So that's fun. All right. Well, those are the videos that we've already had planned for the day. So now we will turn our attention to the super chats, and perhaps if we have some time, it's late on a Friday, so we'll see how it goes. Some other chats as well, but let's see what you guys have been talking about. Too Young to Feel This Old sent me a chicken with a thumbs up. Thank you for that. $3. Appreciate that. Mark Rothenbuehler for US $10. Wow, thank you for that support. I appreciate. Response to Turkvid, Ecclesiastes 1:9. There's nothing new under the sun. Christians create religions today, and charlatans created religions 2,000 years ago too. Making things up is human pastime. Absolutely. Like this whole idea that Frank can't imagine why someone might lie, and yet he totally thinks that Joseph Smith was a liar. He thinks that the Prophet Muhammad was a liar. I mean, that he can't wrap his head around that someone might lie, and we're not even saying that the gospel writers may well have believed every word they were writing down, but there was decades between the first person to say Jesus rose and when finally some literate Greek people got a hold of it and decided to record it. Fish stories happen. People exaggerate stories even when they fully believe all the details. So that Frank can't see that is disturbing and short-sighted, but perhaps that is where his income perhaps requires it to be the case. All right. Frank Fernkampf writes for $10. Thank you. Speaking of my income requiring it, this is your donations are what keep the lights on here. So I do appreciate everyone. Mark writes, in the unlikely event there was a tomb, could the family have taken Jesus' body in the night and buried it properly in Mel's Hole? Yes. Excellent callback. Is this a possible explanation for the resurrection? Absolutely. Mel's Hole, and I'm excited. Unfortunately, tonight wasn't a Toast to Toast night, though we're looking forward to Toast to, I think next week will be a very special Toast to Toast. Absolutely. Mel's Hole. For those who don't know, when this live stream is over, go check out the episodes of Toast to Toast on this channel, specifically 2 episodes on Mel's Hole so far. I don't want to give spoilers, but it definitely does tie into this resurrection notion, including coming back to life. So, yeah, that's fun. Thank you, Mark. That made me laugh. I love it. Olivia Williams, friend of the channel, member for 1 month, writes, hey, Frank, Jesus said to pluck... well, I'll read what you said. Jesus said to puck out your eyes. And I have hockey on the brain a bit tonight, so that's funny. If he's the Lord, why don't you do that? Oh, he never looked at a woman with lust. That's right. So I think you pluck out your eyes is I think the verse. Yes, and it's right. In Matthew, you're supposed to better to any appendage that causes you to sin, better to pluck it out and cast it into the fire. Better to cut it off. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Yeah, Frank's never doing any of that, and Frank has admitted to looking at women lustfully. So I'm sure Ray Comfort has got him cornered on that at some point. Inconsistent. I agree. Thank you, Olivia. Always a pleasure to see you. And I hope you're enjoying your Toast to Toast mug with us tonight. Or not mug, but glass, I think you got. Mark Fernikoff writes, What are the 7 letters Paul wrote and the 6 he didn't? Okay, so I don't want to do this off the top of my head. So 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. So hold on, undisputed letters of Paul. Because I always forget if it's Philemon is the last one. Yeah, Philemon is the last one. So Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon are the ones that are undisputed that he did write. So that would leave off ones like 1st and 2nd Timothy, 2nd Thessalonians, Titus, Hebrews for sure, and I forget if I've counted them all. But anyway, the undisputed for sure: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. So do your own math, I guess, for which ones are not there. Hopefully that is helpful. Philemon's always the one I forget, so my bad. All right, thank you for that. Mark, appreciate you. Jeff Cochran for $2. Actually, as a two-month member, appreciate you. Writes, oh snap, I get 50 characters. The meaning of life is... Oh, damn it. You wasted your characters telling us how many characters you had. Now we'll never know the meaning of life. Jeff, damn it. Oh, well. Maybe we'll have to look up some Jordan Peterson videos so he can tell us how to get to divine. Jeff Cochran writes, R.E. Bill Craig's clip for $5. Appreciate this, Jeff. Theism is like a magic show in which we must take it on faith that the magician exists and some magic happened off stage. That is a great analogy. I love that. So Christians have a hypothetical magician. We just never get to meet them. We're just supposed to... So in Christianity, we wheel it out and there is a rabbit and a hat on stage. And we're supposed to say, trust us. Backstage, there was no rabbit. And I saw them pull it out of there. Yeah, now you're just looking at a rabbit and a hat, which may seem mundane, but if you could have been here earlier, testimony. I love it. Good job, Jeff. Appreciate that. Another one from Jeff Cochran. Does IP think he is also incapable of changing his mind in the face of overwhelming evidence? I trust you probably wrote that early, because later on in the video, he gave examples of where he overcame his wishes and desires from evidence. Like it was very painful for him to admit that he was wrong on theistic evolution and something regarding the Exodus, I think, was the other video that he was talking about, where he's had to retract. So he brought up specifically 2 things that it was painful for him. So he gave his own counterexamples. He gave himself as example, and he's bold enough to think that he's so special that no other human can exist that can also replicate that feat. I don't get it. Okay. Bemd B became a member. Welcome, Bemd. I think that's how you pronounce it. Wayne Rossi, welcome, Wayne. Good to see you here. $5. Resurrection arguments underestimate the likelihood of religious grifters. We see so many in the modern world, we should expect them in history too. And that's the funny part, is that Paul's letters, both the authentic ones and the inauthentic ones, warn that there are people taking sects of Christianity out there that are teaching false doctrines, that are literally distorting Christianity for their own profit motive. So it was happening at the time that Paul was alive as well, right? So why does Frank imagine that, a few years earlier, no, everyone who believed in Christianity was up and up, but by the time Paul came around, they were twisting it and making things like it's the lack of imagination, the lack of understanding that human nature is human nature is astonishing. He just likes to say it fast in front of this college crowd so that it sounds like if you blow through it, you don't pause after every sentence and think about what he said, maybe it sounds like something. All right, Vishanti, been a member for a month. Appreciate you, Vishanti, of course, as always. Hope you're doing well. Apologists keep lowering the bar for omnipotent God, right? So in the last while, we've had William Lane Craig lowering the bar, and then Greg Kokel in my last video was literally out there saying, yeah, he lowers the bar of evidence. It's actually nice to see them at least acknowledging that really it's just about feelings and what they want to be true versus what evidence can show. And once you do that, then yeah, you got to set the bar on the floor. Appreciate you, Ashanti. Thank you for that. Ronan writes, and I don't think you guys can see it on screen there. There we go. $2 for Mel's Hole. Well, I will be sure to take that toonie. I will take the Canadian $2 and chuck it down Mel's Hole and see if we can hear it hit the edge or the bottom. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging out with me today. I'm going to take a peek in the chat. Either do a super chat or tag me if you actually have a question. I have a couple of minutes before I got to go. Not very many. The timing was actually pretty good today. $1 million for me. Captain Christianity. All right. Paulogia Live. Hey, my friend, hope all goes well, and they must lower the bar. It's the only way that they can claim to have evidence. That's right. Yeah, that's it. And again, if it's sufficient to them, then they just feel it's sufficient. When we all know things that, we believe on less than certainty, and sometimes it's nice to find out later, that there is even more evidence, that's great. But the fact that people don't choose what convinces them, so obviously, different things are going to think. Kip Davis wants me to check my email, so that is a thing I will do as soon as this is over. Thank you, Kip. Great show today, by the way. I caught you on Testify. I didn't see all of it because I had errands and work to do, but yeah, that's the case. We have we have Shannon Q in the chat. Welcome, Shannon. Shannon has left me alone. She has gone off to have fun. And so, of course, what do when left to my own devices alone in the house? I work. I get online to hang out with you guys. So, yeah. Linda W. writes, if it's okay for me to say, I think you were adorable. Well, I'm assuming you mean my brain. So, in that case, I appreciate. Thank you so much. Kip, yeah. So, Kip, the Testify thing, Kip was reviewing some recent conflict in the Dead Sea Scroll communities about the scholarship about forgeries and how we should determine those and that kind of thing. It was an excellent show. I thought it was really good. So if that's something in the realm of interest to you, it was great because it was actually a Christian channel that Kip was on. So the bias was entirely potentially in the way to believe the best about the Dead Sea Scroll documents. And so I actually think Eric today was a great example of, man, it would be better for his worldview if Kip was wrong, but he was open to listening to what Kip had to say. So it happens. It happens all over the place. Why am I going live today? Because I was left alone in the house, and that's what I did. Yeah. I am actually also trying. I love the Friday streams. I actually miss when we don't do a toast to toast. So this is kind of a, yeah. I mean, so here's the other part of it. Wasn't willing to admit. I was actually avoiding the Toronto Maple Leafs game because it was, yeah. So because I didn't want to actually see the Toronto Maple Leafs tied up. I knew they would. So anyway, but for the super chat, we appreciate you, William. The Leafs just tied up the game with 5 minutes left to go. An evident miracle. I guess potentially I'll be around for overtime, I guess. Anyway. Vishanti, plug in the Toast to Toast gang. Absolutely. When the stream ends in a minute or two, definitely, if you enjoyed this, we have way more fun. It's pure fun on the Toast to Toast shows. Check those out. And we are DNA. What the puck are you ice holes talking about? Yeah, well, puck out your eyes if you look at someone lustfully. We're all about the pucks tonight. All right. So, I think we're going to leave it there. I'm rolling up to the top of the hour, and this is a great show. Before I ruin it, thank you everyone for tuning in. I appreciate you. And actually, you know what? Now that we're just among friends, just at the very end, so Jenny, the high school teacher, she seems to have stopped producing her show after only the top 6. And now her TikTok is talking about end of school and things to be done. So if some of you, without mentioning my name or you're already on TikTok, because don't download TikTok just for this. But I would love for some people to encourage Jenny to put out at least her 7th reason, so that eventually we can all enjoy the saga along with her. But don't tip our hand. Don't alert her to what's going on here. Just be very nice and encouraging. And I'd love to see part 7 before she takes off for summer. But that's homework assignment for some of you who may choose to enjoy. Anyway, that's a secret mission from me. I appreciate you all. Thanks for watching. And until next time, later.